Welcome everybody to Gateway Church at Home, from our lounge room to your lounge room. We're so honoured that you would choose to spend this time with us, and I hope it blesses you. We're in this series on staying on the plus side, and we've been asking this question of how do we stay on the plus side of life, especially when life doesn't look particularly positive. The bottom line we want to talk about is that when we are intimately connected with our God, we find it so much more natural to see the goodness in life, even in the middle of difficult times. And I've been using the analogy of coals in a fire. You know, Jesus came to set us alight for his purposes. And we can only retain the heat that we need by staying close to his presence. I've spent many hours talking to Gateway people who lost their heat, the passion for God over time, and some just sort of slowly drifted away by getting out of the habit. They just rolled out of the fire. And last week I shared stories of some of our friends who went through such dark experiences that they just jumped out. There were some common denominators that I learnt in all of those stories, and I promised last week that I would share them with you. So that's what we're going to do this morning. So 7 quick thoughts or 7 quick learnings that I found from listening to these precious people. And then I want to share another story from a Gateway guy, and this is a story of incredibly resilient faith. And then I want to leave you with 2 visual pictures that I feel that God gave me. So let's jump right in. 7 quick thoughts. Thought number 1. Resilient faith is often seeded in childhood. You know, every one of the people that I spoke to, when they recalled their darkest moments, they also remembered that at those times, stories would come to them, stories and truths from the Bible that were taught to them either in Sunday school classes or by a faith-filled adult in their life. The greatest thing we can do for our kids, I think it's to imprint their young souls with the knowledge that they are loved unconditionally by God, and that he created them with a purpose which is far, far greater than just their own happiness. You know, I love our kids ministry. There's incredible fruit for the kingdom that comes from our kids ministry. But for some people, that fruit is going to take decades to grow. I love the story that Mark Reynolds shared that when he was going through some dark times when he was part of the motorcycle gang, it was stories that he remembered from his Sunday school days as a young child that came back to him and eventually helped to lead him home. Thought number 2, God is a relentless pursuer. The stories I heard of how God just gently wooed people back they just warmed my heart. You know, he was always there, always whispering his love until that broken-hearted person was ready to hear. I loved Kerry's analogy of feeling like she was deep out in the water and having to swim back to the shore and feeling herself sometimes almost drowning and the waves coming over her. But in hindsight, she knows it was God that held her up and helped her to breathe through all of that time. I love that parable that Jesus tells about the shepherd who leaves the 99 to find the one. He is a relentless pursuer and he will not give up. Thought number 3. God delights in giving second chances and thirds and fourths and. The way that these broken people were lifted up and placed back on their feet and given a purpose in life just shows me some of the character of God. We shouldn't be surprised in the New Testament. We read the incredible story of Paynter, who was Christ's right-hand man. And at that moment when Christ really needed him, when he was arrested, when he was before the courts and being charged of of terrible crimes that would lead to his crucifixion, when he really needed his friends, Peter denied that he knew Christ and ran. But then we have the stories that happened after Christ was resurrected, and he made a point of seeking out Peter, talking to him, forgiving him, and letting him know not only that he still loved him, but that he had an incredible job for him to do, which was to lead the beginning of his precious church. I'm sure that Jesus knew that the humility with which Peter would come through this experience of failure and forgiveness was just what he needed to make him the man that God could rely on to build his church on. Thought number 4, church community is essential in the healing journey. So often the broken-hearted person prayed that God would show up, and so often God answered that prayer through the presence of a godly person. Whether it was an invite to have a coffee or a meal, an invite to be prayed for, or an invite to come to church. Or it was godly people who were keeping the house of God so vibrant and authentic that when broken people walked into a service of worship, they met God straight away. Don't ever doubt that Jesus came to assemble an army who would band together to change the world. Yes, made up of individuals, but single coals cannot burn hot on their own. Thought number 5. God often uses wounded people in the most powerful ways. You know, I think God does his very best work in us when we walk through darkness, when we are forced to rely on his strength and his alone. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he went through some really horrific experiences, but he said that he gloried in his weakness. He said, when I am weak, then I am strong, because he knew that only then that it was Christ's strength that could shine through him and not his own. When we walk through pain, we have the opportunity to bend and change and learn and grow more into the likeness of Christ. Oh, that I could remember that when I'm going through tough stuff. Number 6, we must learn to lament, not grumble. What's the difference? A lament is a passionate expression of sorrow. A grumble is complaining about something in a bad-tempered way. Now, in the Bible is actually full of laments. One example in Psalm 44, you've got the psalmist lamenting to God and saying, but you've turned your back on us, you've walked off and left us, you've rejected us, tossing us aside in humiliating shame. And it goes on for verses and verses where he's just pouring out his sorrow to God. And it seems that God welcomes this honest expression of grief. But grumbling is not welcomed. Why is that? I think it's because we lament in humility, but we grumble in pride. A grumble starts with a hard, proud heart. A grumble says things like, how dare you do this to me, God? Or, how could you let this happen to me? I'm a good person. I have served you. A lament is when we humbly admit to God how desperately lost and sad and alone we feel, how we don't understand what he is doing. We don't understand why he is allowing this to happen to us. But there is an acknowledgement in the lamenting that he is God and we are not. There's an acknowledgement that we don't have his perspective. And we can be like Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he was crucified, who even Christ lamented and said, please take this cup away from me. But then he finished by saying, not my will, God, but yours. And my seventh thought, transactional faith will never lead us to the plus side. What do I mean by transactional? Transactional means if I do this, then you will do that. If you are a Christian, if you're a follower of Christ, and you have this expectation in your life that because you've given your heart to God, that life will be rosy, you are setting yourself up for disillusionment. Ariane, one of the stories we heard last week, admitted that as a young Christian, she followed the rules. She read through the Bible twice, which isn't bad for a young 14-year-old. But when she was viciously attacked, she said, if that's the way God treats his friends, then I want nothing to do with him. You know, Christ never promised us a life without suffering. How could we ever expect that when the author, the beginner of our faith, our example, was cruelly tortured to death on a Roman cross? We are his followers, and he calls us to follow him into suffering as well as into glory and happiness. The promise we do have from him is that he will never leave us, never forsake us, that when we walk through suffering, he will be right there with us. A friend of mine, Helen from Queensland, she told me about losing her son to a drug overdose when he was 21. And she was so angry with God for a long, long time. In a deep prayer time, many years later, she was taken back to the night that she was physically crying over her son and accusing Jesus of deserting her. And God gave her a vision in that prayer. And in that vision, she was finally able to see that rather than an empty room at that dark time, that Christ was sitting there right with her, weeping along with her. I said I would share another story with you. Mark and Sally Ansell have been our friends and co-leaders of Gateway for over 30 years. Mark's got a story to share.
Mark, we've been in leadership in this church for several decades, and as we've walked through some really dark times together. And 10 years ago, you lost your beloved only son, Cain, at the age of 28, which was, I think, probably one of the darkest times for me. And so I can't even imagine what it was like for you and Sal.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was, as you well know, Marcy, it was a very tough time for not only Sally and I, but for Cain's sisters, who loved him dearly too. The context was Cain grew up at Gateway, really, and everybody knew him. He's a great young guy. That's what everybody else says too, so I know that's fairly accurate. He loved people, people loved him, and unfortunately 3 weeks out from his year 12 exams, he experienced his first psychotic episode, and so for the next 11 years we had to deal with deep mental health issues that were very, very painful and draining and traumatic for the family over those 11 years. And so as a family with Sally and myself and his sisters and his wider family and the leadership team, we just quietly did our stuff, and 90% of Gateway wouldn't even have realised what was going on. That was fine. It was only because everybody else had their own lives to get on with. So we battled that for 11 years, right up until he was 28, and then Cain took his own life at the age of 28. So the battle had started 11 years before, really. So when I think about it, and then he took his own life in a very public manner when he was 28, and left a wife and a gorgeous little daughter So that's
Mark, where
sort of,
was God for you in that terrible, terrible time?
he was right there, Marcy, in that I can remember saying very clearly, right at that time, I remember just saying, God, you've got to be here. You have got to turn up now. You have to turn up now. And he was there, but I was just laying it on the line saying, you've got to be right here with me right now, because I knew in those minutes of getting the news that I had a choice to make for myself. And so I was already making a choice. So I wanted him right in the pain with me to walk me through the pain, because I said, God, I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be bitter. But walk with me in this journey that we've just, the worst of the worst of the worst has just happened. We've just found out about. So I asked him, and he turned up. He turned up and right there in that situation for me.
So, that's 10 years. We were just saying nearly 10 years since Cain died.
Yep.
I mean, that's still 10 years of pain.
Oh, absolutely.
How have you processed it through all that time?
Oh, lots of tears ongoing. Even on the weekend was his birthday. So lots of tears that no one sees, and that's fine. That happens in any family where they've lost a loved one like that. And I do want to say at this stage, Marcy, before I go any further, I do want to say, my experience was I asked God into that situation, and he met me right there at that crisis point. But other people, the pain's so immense and so traumatic for them, I can understand that they walk away for a little while or for a long time while that, I certainly empathise and appreciate that pain level that people go through when they just say, you know what, I just got to check out of my faith. But I just, at that point, was able to just say, Lord, you got to walk with me through that and keep going. So that year after was, and for many years after, was a fog. It was hard all the time. Good birthdays, anniversaries, memories. Many, for years, people will walk up to me at supermarkets, as far away as Mentone, right down to Rosebud. I had people walk up to me and I want to talk about my son. And these were not gateway people. That's what blew me away. He'd helped many people over the years. So that it kept coming back to me when I really was trying to bury it somewhere. But it was God's way of saying, hey, Cain did a lot of good in his time.
Mark, you could have snapped and broken. Why didn't you?
That's a great question, Marcy. I know because of 11 years of traumatic experience for myself and the family helping Cain. I just had to rely on God. So the things we've talked a lot about, the spiritual disciplines of just prayer and reading the Word in the morning, just spending time with God, allowing Him to minister to me and the family, really sticking close with Sally, really helped. Staying in the habit, the spiritual discipline of corporate worship, just helping other people, were all good things. Doesn't take away the pain, but it did help me to go, you know what, there's a lot more to life at this time of just trusting God day by day in amongst the tears and the pain, just the rawness of life.
It's a powerful story, isn't it? And through all of these stories that I've heard over the last couple of weeks, I believe God's given me two pictures that I want to share with you. First one is a stick. This is the way many of us feel when we've gone through hard times, dry and brittle. And when things happen to us, when we have this transactional faith that says, well, we've lived this way, so God's got to treat us in a certain way. When something bad happens, we snap. And then, of course, what we do after that is we try our best to heal ourselves. But what happens when we try and heal ourselves? We think we're okay, but we will always snap at the same spot again. You know, God doesn't want to just fix us. He wants to totally remake us into something beautiful and fresh and new, that's pliable, that can bend, that we don't have to have all the answers, but we have this ability to just bend with the uncertainties and the difficulties and the greyness in life. The Bible talks in Psalms about being a tree planted by the water and having that ability to just bend. That's how God wants to remake us. Not like this, but like this. The other picture he gave me is that God calls us to walk with him through suffering, but he is also in the redemption business. Suffering is part of our Christian walk, but so is peace and joy and healing, if not in this life, then in the next. So I think what he's calling us to do is to be able to carry our suffering, and I've used this sort of barren stone as a symbol of that, carry our suffering and our joy and promise, one in the left hand and one in the right, and know that both of these are an essential part of the Christian walk. But let me just take the analogy a little bit further. Any philosopher will tell you that life is going to be full of dark times and good times. But for the Christ follower, it's not just a matter of waiting till this is over so we can see this. With Christ, he can make the flower bloom out of the barrenness. He can bring them both together in this beautiful analogy. He can take the dark times and use them to grow us into something beautiful. I wanted to finish with a favourite quote from Rob Bell, who was referring to a mentor of his who showed him Jesus. And I want to dedicate this to my friends Mark and Sally Ansell, and to the many older saints of the church who have watched the miracle of painful stones blossom into beautiful flowers. He was a man of faith, deeply grounded in his convictions, and yet those firm convictions didn't close him down or harden him or make him brittle and close-minded. They had the exact opposite effect. They seemed to make him more flexible and limber and engaging. Like a tree planted near water with deep roots, a storm comes and the tree doesn't break because it's grounded enough to bend. Regardless of what you've been through, regardless of what you're going through right now, Christ is there with you and he's for you. You can come back stronger.